So anytime we're doing evaluation research, this would be things like, in criminal justice, we're talking about things like evaluating programs in prisons to prevent recidivism, like anger management programs, or programs related to alcoholism or drug use. So things like that, anytime you're doing any kind of evaluation, it may seem to just be like, oh, well, you're just seeing if programs are working. There's actually a lot more to it than that. There are 5 main types of evaluation research that you can do. So these are needs assessments, valuability assessments, process evaluations, or program monitoring, impact or outcome evaluation, which is typically the one that sort of comes to mind, just in terms of is it doing what it's supposed to do, and then efficiency studies. So let's look at these one by one. So starting with a needs assessment. So a needs assessment basically determines whether the program itself is needed and what the population that we're looking at, what they need. So if we're looking at, something in the community, in a certain neighborhood, well, what does that neighborhood need? Maybe they have a fairly decent police presence, so we don't need to increase that, but maybe we need to increase, community involvement in things, and so that would be what they need. Or if we're looking at a particular group of offenders, well, maybe, their recidivism rates are actually fairly low already, but, they need more support in the community for, to keep those rates low, or because it's the anxiety that comes with not being able to get a job or a place to live that is what leads to recidivism, and so that's maybe what we need to address. So it's about ascertaining the nature and scope of the problem that the program is designed to address. So whatever program we're looking at, it has a purpose. And so a needs assessment is basically, well, are there enough people who need this thing before we put a whole lot of money and time into it? Is it needed? So might be asking if a new program is needed. So maybe we have a problem that we haven't been able to address. And so maybe the needs assessment is looking at, well, if we come up with something new to address these things, will that actually be helpful? Or is it about, well, an existing program that's currently in place, is that still needed? So it can be either or. And so then if a program is needed, well, is this one, whether it's new or existing, is that the right one that we need? And so that's another question. And so to do that, we want to look at, well, what's the nature and scope of the problem? But then also we want to look at the target population, the population that is believed to have the need for that program, or that the program is supposed to serve, its intended audience, basically. And so maybe you want to look at the characteristics of the population. Is this program appropriate for this population? You don't want to have a really great program that's shown a lot of efficiency and effectiveness, but, it requires kind of, a high level of education and understanding, and you don't want to provide that to, inmates that have really low functioning or low intellect. It's not going to work. So you have to look at what your target population is and make sure that is the proper program for them and sort of what is needed to get what you want. So a needs assessment is you're not doing anything yet, you're just assessing what you need and what programs may or may not be effective and helpful for that group. So nothing is being implemented yet. So then you have an evaluability assessment. Still nothing is being, there's no program that's actually in place yet at this point. So this is, evaluability assessment is basically trying to figure out whether the program, so you've determined that there's a need for this program, we want to implement it, but can the program be evaluated given how much time we have and the resources available? So, because you don't want to put a program in place that right off the bat you can't assess whether it's effective or not. Because if you can't assess whether it's effective or not, then you need to change it before you put it into play. So because you don't want to have this program in place that you can't on an ongoing basis determine whether it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. So evaluability is before you start, make sure you will be able to assess this program once it's in place. So some possible barriers to this. Stakeholders can sometimes be a barrier to this because stakeholders are people who have a vested interest in the program and they want it to succeed. And stakeholders tend to only want good news. They don't care about rigorous evaluation or whether the program is actually having its intended effects, but only whether they look better for doing it. That's often the case. So that can be a possible barrier if that's what your stakeholders are interested in. Sometimes we look at program staff if they are alienated or distrustful of evaluators, or of anyone who's sponsored by management to like check up on them. That could be a possible barrier as well. So you're not going to be able to accurately assess a program if the people who are delivering the program aren't on board with that assessment, if they feel like they're being checked up on, and then they don't trust the people who are there to assess. Also, another barrier is if the goals are really too vague, or people can't agree what the actual goals of this program are. And so if program staff lack a clear understanding of the program's aims, and they're just, helping people, or they're just putting in the time, that's not going to be a very easily assessed, at least. And especially if these goals are not, if you're not agreed upon by the stakeholders, and so if the stakeholders sort of are coming back into it as, well, we don't really know what we want out of this, we just want to look better, there can be overlapping barriers there. Also, we look at a lot of programs are mixed, and programs under evaluations are not always clearly distinct from other services, and they can't always be evaluated by themselves. That can be a barrier as well, because if you have sort of this big program that incorporates things like, say we're talking about an inmate population, and it's got anger management, but also addresses alcoholism and drug use, and also addresses, sort of practical things like learning how to get a job and things like that, and sort of it's all wrapped into one big program, then it's difficult to tease out the specific parts to see if they're doing what they should be doing. So when you have mixed program delivery, which often it is, because that saves on resources, but then that makes it harder to assess. So it may then help for in terms of evaluability to clarify those program goals or refine the program operations. So do that before you start the implementation of any program. You make sure that's clear, so that can help with some of those barriers. But also, if you determine that evaluation will not provide useful information until the program implements some kind of changes, then basically that means that there are these changes that must be made before you can start this program. And often those suggested changes can be put into place very easily, as long as you know in advance. So for example, maybe staff need to be trained better, or more specifically, goals and implementations need to be standardized. Anything like that is going to help with evaluability later can be done right up front. So then a process evaluation, this is basically determining, so once the program now has started, determining if it's working as intended. So as it's going, is it basically working according to how it was designed? And so this is the one also known as program monitoring. So as it's going, you're monitoring as it's underway. So basically you want to see if it's operating according to its original purpose and design. So is it doing what it says it's doing? Is it given to the people who are supposed to get it? Is it the right people that are getting this program? Maybe some parts are working, and maybe sort of it doesn't look like it's necessarily working, but effects are actually canceling each other out. And this is where you can help figure out if portions of the program are working while other portions are not. So for example, you may have released offenders in halfway houses. They have less economic needs. They're under better surveillance, so that's great. But they're also less likely or less able to work. So they won't feel the anxiety about needing to make rent or something like that, because there is no rent. They'll have more eyes watching them, so surveillance is better. But they'll also have more free time to commit crimes, and more association with other criminals in the halfway house will happen too. So maybe the halfway house itself, it's not all bad, but parts of it are working and parts of it aren't. And so a process evaluation would tease that apart and then try to address what's not working properly. So typically, it uses both quantitative and qualitative data for this. You can use program records, participant or community surveys, comparisons between program users and non-users, or people who are dropouts or people who are ineligible. And it's especially useful for really complex programs with many elements or programs delivered over time. So that's when you want to use a process evaluation. And then you have the impact or outcome evaluation. So this is just determining whether the program's effective. So this is typically what comes to mind when you think of evaluation research, is, well, seeing if things are working. And so basically these are about, well, did the program have the intended consequences? Did the independent variable affect the dependent variable? And so you want to see if the if the outcome being the effects on the clients, and the impact being effect on sort of the larger system or community. But typically, this is the most popular type of evaluation research because this is often the question we want to know. Well, does this program work? Yes or no? So if it works, then we're going to try to implement it. And so this is often what has to be. So some of those other things are not always done for every program, but typically you have to have an impact evaluation or an outcome evaluation of some kind. Or impact analysis is what this is also called. So often this uses either true experimental designs, or much more often it's quasi-experimental, because selection bias typically makes it difficult to use true experimental designs. But generally you're comparing the group that received the program or treatment to the group that didn't. So you have the pretest, you implement the program, and then see if you got that desirable outcome or not. And so then we have the efficiency evaluation. And so this is basically, okay, well, if we determine that the program actually had the desired outcome, well, now we compare those effects that it had, the positive effects that we wanted, to the costs. So basically, do the benefits that we got, do they offset the costs? Because if you have like a slight improvement in your group, but it like costs a whole lot of time and energy and money to do this thing, is it worth that small little improvement? Is there some other way we can get that improvement without spending all this time and money and resources? So basically you're asking if the benefits of the program offset the costs of providing that treatment or service. And so there's two general types of efficiency evaluation. So you can have a cost benefit. So basically you're just comparing the costs to the monetary value of the outcome. So you're just saying, well, it costs this much per person, and this is what we save, for every time somebody doesn't commit a crime or something. So that's sort of the most basic type. Then you can also have a cost effectiveness. So this compares cost to actual outcomes. So, how much does it cost to achieve a specific outcome? So that's a little bit more difficult to put numbers on, but you can sort of basically say, well, if we want, say, our recidivism risk or recidivism outcome to reduce by this much, by 10%, by 25%, whatever we want, how much does that cost? And so that's a cost effectiveness analysis. And so the difficult part about this is that evaluators have to figure out what these costs and benefits all are and measure them in dollar amounts. And that can be very difficult to do, especially this would be especially true for cost benefit, because cost effectiveness, your outcome is not necessarily needing to be monetized, but still the cost is. When you're doing cost benefit, it's literally how much are we saving and how much are we spending, and everything has to be put in dollar amounts. And I mean, when you think about something like, well, if you stop somebody from committing a violent crime, how do you put that in dollars? I mean, you can talk about the victim costs, so things like, missed work and hospitalization costs and court costs and all that stuff, and also then sort of related to the offender costs, so their court costs, their policing and everything related to law enforcement that has to put that person back through the program or through the system, and then if they end up going back to prison, then that's a cost. So it's not easy, for sure, for evaluators to do this. There are ways to do it, and sort of you can look to see what other groups have done when you look at similar policies that have been evaluated. But it's a difficult thing to put dollar amounts on sometimes, and so it's often these kinds of evaluations will be accompanied by, well, here's the dollar amounts, but also here are kind of the human costs and sort of some of the things that play into that. But it's not always easy. But an efficiency evaluation then is basically about, are we getting what we want efficiently? So not only are we effective, but are we efficient as well? And that's what efficiency evaluations are. So those are all the different types of evaluation research that you can do.